Horn is the rated 6-star commemorating the release of Chapter 10 on the Cliff's Rage banner. She's a fortress defender, i.e. the same archetype as Ashlock. She offers a ridiculous amount of damage to the point where her placement in the defender class is rather questionable. In this video, I'll talk about her skills, her applications, and how she fares against our current operator lineups. The TLDR for if anyone should pull for her is a definitive yes. She is the strongest operator released in recent memory for most people, and she's really close, if not ranked, in the top 10 6-star operators. Quick intermission for a bit of self-promotion. I'll be starting to stream on Twitch soon, and I'll appreciate it if you could drop me a follow. Link will be in the description. Now onto the actual video. Given Horn's status as a defender, one might expect her to have a high block count, and while she does, that's where all the similarities end. In a general sense, she's fairly squishy, alongside boasting uncharacteristically high attack. As a downside, she has a very high attack interval of 2.8 seconds, although this is in part mitigated by her skill 3 as well as her talent 2. In addition, she has a very weird range characteristic of a fortress defender, and this heavily incentivizes placing her away from the front lines. Her first talent, Military Fortress, is fairly boring but is still very substantial in giving all defender operators 20% attack. Her second talent is the more interesting one, wherein it's basically a rehash of Skadi's module. After being eliminated for the first time, she does not retreat and instead recover all health at the expense of halving her max health. In addition, this talent allows her to gain a substantial amount of attack speed and defense after the revive. Although this seems incredibly broken at first glance, one can just think of this as plus 50% max health to Horn and some stat buffs of attack speed and defense when she is below that threshold. Now onto her skills. S1 Illumination Grenade is a power strike auto recovery skill much akin to Aya Fearless skill 2. It empowers her next attack to deal 280% physical damage, as well as increasing the splash area. It also illuminates the target area for 8 seconds, removing invisibility from all enemies. However, this part is largely irrelevant given that she cannot initially hit invisible enemies with the skill in the first place, and thus cannot reveal them. Regardless of that though, the skill is still very powerful in its own right and manages to stand up, at least in terms of feel, to the other power strike contenders such as Aya Fearless skill 2. Its main contender is Fimetta's skill 3, however the fact that Horn has controlled bursts of damage with the 2 charges as opposed to the consistent long-range bombardment, as well as the fact that Horn does not require charging, makes her a solid tier higher in my opinion. In the CN community, there is something known as low step, i.e. the clearing of stages with minimal actions. Deploying an operator counts as one action, and so does activating skills. In this category, Horn's skill 1 by itself manages to land herself in the top tier alongside Mudrock, surpassing even Blaze. Indeed, the clip that I'm showing on screen shows Horn absolutely obliterating H7-4, one of the hardest stages in terms of stat checks. Of course, the skill is not going to have much usage inside of CC content due to the dynamic cycling nature which works against power strike skills. However, in game modes such as integrated strategies, it is still a very strong skill. The one downside maybe being that it cannot gain benefits from pasta aside from the first row of its range. Moving on, Horn's skill 2 Storm Order is a fairly interesting skill with the whole ammo mechanic and all. This skill also introduces a mechanic called Overdrive, which I'll elaborate on further. Upon skill activation, she gains 10 ammo and each attack consumes 1 hit of ammo in order to deal 240% physical splash damage. Upon consuming 5 ammo, i.e. when the skill reaches the halfway duration, the Overdrive effect is activated and empowers each attack with 60% of her attack as extra arts damage. In addition, she can manually deactivate the skill to fire all remaining shots in one volley but lose 60% of her health in the process. In isolation, this is a fairly decent burst skill, boasting a respectable amount of damage, and it also has a hidden mechanic which isn't stated in-game, i.e. it makes her melee attacks also deal splash damage. Her other 2 skills have the weird effect wherein an enemy stepping in melee range would get meleeed, but it wouldn't have the physical splash effect, so effectively turning Horn into a significantly worse single target damage dealer. However, when enemies enter melee range in skill 2, she activates a fiery sword and slashes at them, dealing melee AoE damage. This combined with the fact that you can instantly deactivate her overdrive and fire all of the bullets to get a huge burst is what causes the skill to remain somewhat relevant. However, as a durational DPS option, it is generally overshadowed by her skill 3, the final line of defense. It grants her a small attack boost of 70%, but also greatly reduces her attack interval. After 12 seconds have passed, i.e. half of the 24-second duration, her attack increase goes from 70% to 140%, and she starts gradually losing health, similar to Serta's self-bleed. The difference here is that the skill can be manually deactivated, i.e. stopping the bleed, and also the fact that the bleed is actually beneficial for Horn, given that after 2 to 3 users it can reduce her health below 0 and therefore proc her passive, gaining a sizable DPS increase. Talking about damage numbers, the skill has 3 major breakpoints, one being skill activation without overdrive, skill activation with overdrive, and overdrive paired with talent 2. With Talent 2 active, Horn boasts 2.4k DPS without overdrive, which is fairly impressive on its own given that Silverash barely scratches 1.9k. However, with overdrive the DPS skyrockets to 3.3k, which is some of the highest we've seen in the game yet. The skill also has a very respectable cycle with a 35 total SP cost, 25 initial, and 24 second duration. The absurd damage per second capability as well as the physical damage type leads a lot of people to claim that she is ranged Chowder, and I'll be inclined to somewhat agree. To tone back the excitement a bit though, a large portion of Chowder's power comes from the ability to hold the skill active, and it is something that Horn sorely lacks. Skill 3's absurd strength is why Skill 2 gets crowded out a fair bit in terms of general content, wherein the only use for Skill 2 over Skill 3 is if the timing is really tight and you need to squeeze out the last shots with the deactivation of the skill. To this end, for most players, I'll recommend going for S3M3 as well as S1M1 for the -1 SP cost and leave the other skills alone. For more aspiring players, S1M1, S2M3 and S3M3 can be a consideration, but Horn, generally speaking, is not a horrible M9 target. One consideration many players may have is how Horn's range affects her usage in regular maps and how big of a detriment it is. While I wouldn't necessarily call it a detriment, I do notice myself placing her significantly differently based on my current knowledge of the map, enemies, as well as how the lanes look. As opposed to units like Chowder, Surda, where you can just generally place them at the front and not expect anything bad to happen, Horn does require some thought, given that enemies that reach her melee range are really detrimental to her, and you also have to plan around the overdrive to a small extent. To a more extreme extent, one can look at her performance in the earlier flaws of IS-2 and IS-3 relative to the other more rarity abuse options, and easily see that she isn't as strong a solo carry as she might seem. As cheesy as it sounds, Arknights is a game built from ranged and melee tiles, and attempting to abstract the role of a ranged carry into something more melee-like, while it does work and leads to extremely good applications, also has a lot of scenarios where you can't really use Horn properly or have to use her in a very gimped fashion. She's still easily applicable on 80 to 90% of the maps, but those are the outliers that prevent her from truly being in the best tier. For higher end content in Contingency Contract, the long-range durational burst of Horn will always have a use given that it is really the only option we have at the moment. Historically, looking at past CCs, it's really not hard to imagine Horn in one of them. CC4, you could snipe across the map and deal physical damage in conjunction with a hypothetical Chowder for a physical burst. In CC5, there were 2 lanes and you could relatively simply put Horn in the middle lane to target the left one. CC6, you could kill the casters up top with Horn as opposed to Gladia, and in CC7 there's a variety of safe tiles for Horn to target the middle side without getting killed by the Smarties. It's unlikely that she'll have a more optimal usage than CC9 considering how CC9 was basically tailor-made for Horn, but that's more than enough to cement Horn as a very solid, high-end unit for these type of contexts. As previously established, she's phenomenal in low step, and she's probably decent in low op as well, although defenders aren't really the premier choice for that. For obvious reasons, she's also a sample of Defender Knights if you're one of the 3 players in EN who play it. On a more general note, although she might be strictly weaker in general content as opposed to some other units, I still find her more fun and interactive to use given that you actually have to use your brain to position her, and she comes in very handy in terms of IS-2 and IS-3, given that the defender tickets actually have a use besides Mudrock, who oftentimes lack damage, especially in hard mode. In the context of every operator between Ling and Pazemka, i.e. the 2 limited banners, Horn is easily the best option, surpassing Golden Glow, Spouter, and the rest. Given that she far outclasses the units from her until Pazemka, I highly recommend rolling for her, and this is one of the operators where you'll be able to experience her power from the get-go and not feel disappointed about the correct positioning or correct placements as you might with Golden Glow off your meta. Horn is a long-range devastator that will absolutely have a place in your squad, plus she's really cute too. May you have good luck pulling for Horn and get less off banners than I do.